Welcome to Data Center Go-to-Market Sales and Marketing Q&A. I'm Joshua Feinberg from DCSMI, your host of our weekly live Q&A show, where each week I tackle a handful of the biggest sales and marketing challenges that we're hearing about from all over the data center ecosystem, from data center operators like colocation, hyperscale, edge, modular, wholesale data center providers, as well as the dozens of different kinds of data center technology and data center facilities related companies, plus all of those construction, real estate, and investment related companies. And of course, the vibrant outsourced sales and marketing ecosystem in and around data centers, critical facilities, and digital infrastructure. And the Data Center Go-to-Market Sales and Marketing Q&A show is for you if you work anywhere on the go-to-market team, including sales, such as an account executive or SDR or BDR, sales development rep or business development rep, or perhaps you work in some facet of marketing like field marketing, events marketing, social media, demand generation, product marketing. Perhaps you work in some facet of post-sales responsibilities, such as being an account manager, or solutions engineer, or client success, or perhaps some facet of product management or innovation or channel partnerships, or maybe you're the leader, the executive sponsor who is responsible for going out into the marketplace and recruiting the best and brightest to your team, getting the right people in the right seats on the bus, rowing the boat at the right speed, playing their musical instruments at just the right time, at the right tempo, and at the right volume to make this magical symphony of go-to-market growth happen in and around data centers, critical facilities, and digital infrastructure. If this is the first time you're joining us, welcome. We're thrilled to have you with us. If you've been with us before for Data Center Go-to-Market Sales and Marketing Q&A, welcome back to our frequent flyers. We're thrilled to have you with us as well. And we'd love if you could just take a moment right now, whatever platform you're watching on, and let us know what you do in the data center ecosystem. Just drop that into the comment section. So, what is on the agenda for this week's show? First, we're going to start by looking at how a colocation data center can build brand awareness. Big, popular, really popular part of the data center operator ecosystem. After that, we'll talk about how a data center software-defined infrastructure provider can compete with better funded VC-backed, venture-backed firms. After that, we'll turn our attention to how a data center telecommunications account executive, how a telecommunications AE can get meetings with the right person at the right time. That'll put us right on the 50-yard line, right at the halfway point. We'll take a real quick break for a message from our sponsor. And in the second half of this week's Data Center Go-to-Market Sales and Marketing Q&A show, we'll look at how a digital infrastructure provider can generate quality leads. Next, we'll get into how a data center energy efficiency consultancy can market and sell getting kilowatts, KWs, back and easier operations. And as we head down the home stretch on this week's show, our final topic that we'll be looking at this week is all about how to close colocation and data center sales faster, how to close sales faster for colocation and data center services. If you have an idea for a topic or a question or a challenge that you think we should address in an upcoming show, be sure to leave that in the comments on whatever platform that you're watching on, and we will add that to the consideration queue for an upcoming episode of Data Center Go-to-Market Sales and Marketing Q&A. And if you want to make sure that you get notified about upcoming shows, educational events, educational resources just like this, make sure that you're subscribed to our Data Center Sales and Marketing newsletter that comes to your email inbox each Sunday. You can sign up, you can subscribe for free directly on our website at www.dcsmi.com. So without any further delay, let's jump right into this week's first topic, our first question, which is all about colocation data center brand awareness. So how do we build colocation data center brand awareness? That is a fantastic question. So to just set the groundwork, set the foundation here, Co-location operators are one of the most popular kinds of business models among data center operators. Other kinds of data center operator business models include data center operators that focus primarily on selling much larger spaces for much larger financial commitments to usually much fewer, in some cases, just one single tenant. In other words, if you've ever heard the term multi-tenant, that usually refers to co-location, where single tenant usually refers to either a wholesale data center provider or a hyperscale data center operator. So co-location operators, first cousins of hyperscale data center operators, first cousins of edge data center providers. Edge data center provider is usually much smaller facilities. It doesn't have to be, but it usually is, where your clients, your tenants are paying a premium for a very specific, precise location as opposed to just being located within a particular region. And edge usually is extremely important for latency sensitive applications like smart cars, smart cities, autonomous cars, AI, a lot of IoT specific applications, a lot of financial applications. So a lot of applications where it's super important to be at a very specific location as opposed to just being in a particular city or town or particular region. So that's edge data centers. Then there's wholesale data center providers, kind of similar business model to hyperscale data center operators. Usually hyperscale data center operators were a little more involved in the IT services, whereas wholesale data center providers typically are leasing an empty shell to a company that comes in and builds to suit for whatever the heck they want it to be. And then the fifth category, it's kind of like a data center provider, hybrid data center operator, is modular data center providers, modular data center operators. These are data centers that can be put on wheels and shipped on trucks, on railroad cars, potentially on barges overseas to very specific locations on very short-term notice. They usually have big applications for events. They have big applications for disaster recovery. And what clients, what operators, what end users love about modular data centers is if you need a data center placed somewhere in a matter of days, you can make that happen with a modular data center. And if you decide in 3 months it doesn't need to be in that specific location anymore, you can make arrangements to move that modular data center to somewhere else. So those are the 5 different kinds of data center operator business models, of which co-location operators are a significant part of that. In addition to data center operators, there's also a few dozen different kinds of data center technology companies like cybersecurity, storage, networking, cabling, connectivity. There's also data center facilities related companies. Some of the more popular kinds of data center facilities related companies would be like power, cooling, energy, commissioning, decommissioning, physical security. So in addition to data center operators and data center technology companies and data center facilities companies, there's also data center construction, first cousins of data center real estate, first cousins of data center investment. So we place data center construction side by side in the same category as data center real estate and data center investment. And then in the fifth part of the data center ecosystem, there's all of the outsourced sales and marketing related companies that work and specialize in and around data centers, critical facilities, and digital infrastructure. These could include some of the most commonly thought of ones like marketing agencies, PR agencies, sales brokers. A lot of times people don't think of recruiters as part of outsourced sales and marketing, but we do for sure. You're certainly marketing and selling a company for employment opportunities. There's data center media companies. There's data center conferences, also known as data center events businesses. Sometimes training is even considered part of that. Manufacturers, reps, brokers, consultancies that get paid strictly on performance. They're all part of outsourced sales and marketing. So we're oriented for where we need to be. We've gotten our bearings for where data center co-location companies, co-location data centers are within data center operators. So that's the first foundational part that's really important. What does it mean to actually build a brand awareness, though, in today's data center ecosystem? And this one's worth a little bit of making sure we're on the same page as well, because 10 years ago, if we were talking about building a data center related brand, you would have said, let me go get our creative director. And you'd be right, because for 10 years, 20 years, 30 years before this, for companies that operate in and around mission critical real estate and IT services, typically a brand was something that was 100% within the control of your creative director. And at the time, you needed a PhD in Adobe Creative Suites, and very few people were allowed to physically touch that didn't come from that same kind of training and pedigree. But over time, thanks to tools like Adobe Express and probably the most popular one and around the data center ecosystem, Canva. Canva has been a big force in democratizing design. There's a lot more people that are non-designers who are able to get professional looking designs using templates out the door relatively quickly, especially for relatively routine things where there's not enormous leverage riding on the line. Increasingly, what's super interesting is on the Data Center Go-to-Market podcast, I've interviewed a couple sales leaders in the past few months that come from Fortune 1000 enterprise data center power facilities related companies. And one of their favorite tools that their teams all use now is Canva. So Canva has done a remarkable job. I think the company's only about 12 or 15 years old, but now publicly traded, in getting anyone and everyone who has an interest in being able to modify templates and get digital assets out faster that help move the needle on go-to-market to make that those powers, that agility, that speed, the customization more widespread. So there's that aspect of building brand awareness isn't limited to just your creative director, just your graphic designers anymore. And there's certainly still part of that with establishing what the brand guide looks like and setting up the templates to make marketers and salespeople and account managers and channel partner managers and entrepreneurs able to go much faster. There's another element of building brand awareness too that I want to make sure that we talk about. Building your brand today is no longer just limited to aesthetics. It's no longer just about your hexadecimal colors, your standardized fonts, your logos. Your brand is so much more than that. Your brand is now what the marketplace says about you when you're not in the room. And given that we now predominantly have a self-guided buyer's journey in the data center ecosystem, meaning that most of your prospects and clients want to navigate most of their researching, comparing options, and decision-making on their own without talking to someone from your team until they're almost ready to buy. In some cases, they're going through 100% of the buyer's journey on their own, and it's truly self-service. But for most categories, most of the 57 different business models in the data center ecosystem, there's still a need for some degree of sales professionals to be involved in the research and decision-making process. However, the challenge is especially for highly technical, somewhat cynical IT buyers and engineering buyers and other buyers in the data center ecosystem, they're more sales allergic than they've ever been. And Gartner, and we found this pretty much the same thing, 83% of a typical journey now happens before you get to meet a prospect. That means 83% of their researching, comparing options and decision-making, evaluating pricing now happens without you in the room. And that's a massive change from as recently as 10 years ago, where you had a lot more surface area in the sales cycle and the buyer's journey than just the final 17%. In the 10 years ago, it was roughly half. They would get to about 56% of a typical journey, and they'd be willing to spend the final 44% with folks like yourself, learning and figuring out what they wanted and defining needs and honing in on what the best solution looked like for their particular company. So given that so many traditional salespeople are now persona non grata, largely getting excluded from a lot of these really important conversations, how do we get you back in there? So it's not enough to just build brand awareness. We need to figure out a way to ensure that you stay relevant in a self-driven buyer's journey. Because by default, a lot of your prospects, a lot of your clients think that they can do this without you. And the irony with all this is the crazy hyper growth that we're going through now, driven by AI and supercomputing and high performance computing, especially on the backs of companies like NVIDIA and OpenAI and generative AI. The world is getting so used to using tools like ChatGPT and Claude and Perplexity and Gemini and Copilot that these are largely replacing traditional search engine lookups that people used to do 5, 10, 15 years ago. So 10 years ago, it was very common that you'd meet a prospect or a client and they'd done a lot of research on your topic, on your segment, on your category by looking up that topic on Google, by watching some YouTube videos, by posing some questions to their peers on LinkedIn. And that all is certainly there. but they could only get so far. And then they were willing to fill out a form. They were willing to spend time with you. Because of generative AI and the relationship that people have with their generative AI tools, it's actually considerably more intimate than it was when they were just asking, hey, Alexa, hey, Google, hey, Siri. Now with ChatGPT and Copilot and Gemini and Claude and Perplexity, a lot of the research in those generative AI tools is replacing what used to happen in mid-sales cycle, mid-journey, not to confuse you with the mid-journey tool, like those consideration stage, middle of the funnel kinds of conversations, as well as early stage conversations are happening in these tools. So we need to work extra hard to get you back in there. So it's not just a matter of building up your company's brand awareness as a co-location data center. It's building up your professional brand as an expert on anything and everything having to do with co-location data centers and digital infrastructure and the 5, 10, 20 dozens of adjacent topics or leading indicators that show that someone's going to be in market for needing co-location data center services in the coming weeks and in the coming months. And we know when it comes to co-location data center agreements, we know they tend to be pretty long-term. It's quite common to find data center operators and clients engaging in 24-month or 36-month agreements. So it's super important that we have this mindset of trying to figure out how we get you in early and how we get you in often. Because if we just get you in early once and a couple of weeks or a couple of months goes by, that's not good. It's leaving you really vulnerable to other competitive forces with someone that can prove to be more helpful, more insightful, more of a trusted advisor. And that's what largely what this is about, is getting you out of the vendor box, getting you out of being perceived as just after a transaction or opening up a deal and carrying something through pipeline. No, we want instead for your prospects and clients to perceive that you're not an account executive so much anymore, or a sales development rep or an account manager or a marketer. No, you're an expert, a subject matter expert. You're a teacher, you're a consultant, you're a trusted advisor. You may even be considered a thought leader on anything and everything that's hyper relevant for this particular kind of client at a company in this particular region that's roughly this size in this kind of industry for this particular kind of stakeholder. And it's really hard as a small co-location operator to boil the ocean and compete across the board, but it becomes a lot more doable when you, for example, as an account executive or an account executive that you hire has had a long career working with media and telecommunications companies, and they join your company, and after 3-6 months of onboarding, they start to learn their way around the co-location ecosystem. And now they actually have a lot of street cred with their peers in these media and telecommunications companies in a particular region of companies of roughly that size and specific kinds of job roles. So a lot of what we're doing here is we're trying to figure out a way to create a learning and development, a professional development environment so that your prospects and clients are highly motivated to want to spend time with your client-facing team members, because they don't see your client-facing team members as part of a vendor anymore. They see your client-facing team members as a key part of closing the gap on the skills that you need to have from a learning and development, from a professional development standpoint, that align perfectly or nearly perfectly with that buyer persona's biggest goals and challenges that they're dealing with individually, as a team, and as a company as it relates to digital infrastructure. So let's say, for example, and this is a very, very common scenario with co-location operators that are selling to the small to mid-sized business, is maybe your primary buyer persona is an IT executive in a mid-market company that's located within a 30-mile drive of where you're located. And they tend to be in a media company, a telecommunications company, manufacturing, or financial services. In addition to that primary buyer persona, you may also discover that you do really well with channel partners, and your secondary buyer persona may be the owner of a small to mid-sized managed service provider or a value-added reseller like an MSP or a VAR, an integrator, or something like that. So once you figure that out, and again, obviously your results will vary depending on the nature of your business model, how big or small your company is, your target audience, your capabilities, a whole host of factors. But let's say, for example, your primary buyer persona is an IT executive of a mid-market company. Your secondary buyer persona is the owner, the CEO, the president, the founder, or equivalent of a small to mid-sized channel partner. So for each of those, they're each going to have different goals that they're working on at any given time and different challenges that they're struggling with. How do we know what these goals and challenges are? Because we're going to do our homework. We're going to go out and do customer insight research. Conversations face to face or over video would be the best way to approach this. If you can't do that, surveys would be the second best. Third best, if you don't have access to any of that, at the absolute minimum, take a representative stack of 10 or 12 people in that segment and study how they describe themselves on their LinkedIn profile, see what skills they're endorsed for, see what kind of content they share, what kind of groups they belong to, how they communicate with each other publicly when they're commenting on threads. Take the same kind of information, go run a search and see what else you can find out about that individual. If you're really fortunate, you'll find some multimedia content, like you'll find them interviewed on a podcast or speaking at a webinar or speaking at a conference. So you'll not only be able to get an idea about what they care about, but you'll actually be able to see body language and intonation. So the goal with all of this is, say we study 10 or 20 of these IT directors, what are their 5 or 6 goals that you hear most often that they're working on? And not just guessing about what these goals are, but what these goals are actually in their own words. And then conversely, and these are, again, goals that they could be working on individually. It's goals that their team is working on, that their company is working on, that directly relates to their job. And then the flip side of that is, in addition to their goals, and these also sometimes show up in job descriptions, they can show up in OKRs, objectives and key results, or the key performance indicators, the KPIs that they work on. So the flip side of the professional goals is the frustrations, the challenges, the stressors, the things that are driving them nuts. So what are the 5 or 6 biggest stressors that IT executive is dealing with that we discovered through doing this research? And we really need to get those goals and those challenges in their own words. That's incredibly important for coming up with, for website copywriting, for product marketing, email marketing, sales enablement, events, ads, pretty much everything where you're trying to nail relevance. So we do that customer insight research for our primary persona. We do that for our secondary buyer persona, the MSP owner. And then for each of those, we make sure that we have a great website page for each of those on our site. We have a great, highly relevant lead generation offer that's providing so much promised value that it's a no-brainer that they'll trade a little bit of their information for what's on the other side of the landing page. But most importantly, we want to get in there often. And the best way to get in there often is, in addition to traditional email marketing and email newsletters, we need an events program. And the best kind of events program for a co-location operator is one in which that persona, that IT executive, that MSP owner, ideally separately, if you have enough bandwidth to be able to run 2 different funnels, 2 different pipelines, whatever you want to call it, like this, 2 different programs, is so they're visiting your facility to learn with you, grow with you. And as part of that, you can attach a tour to that. So here's how that might go for IT executives that are within a 30 or 60 minute drive of where you're located, MSP owners that are within a 30 or 60 minute drive of where you're located. Let's say you're like most co-location operators, and in your facility, you have a nice little classroom or conference room that can comfortably seat, I don't know, at least 10, 15, 20 people. Your goal 12 times a year, once a month, should be to fill up that conference room for a 60 to 90 minute breakfast seminar, for a 60 or 90 minute lunch and learn for each of those groups separately. So let's say the first week of the month, you invite your primary buyer persona, you invite the IT executives. The third week of the month, you invite your MSP owners. And here's how it goes. Let's say it's a breakfast seminar that starts at 9 o'clock in the morning. From 8:30 to 9, you have nice continental breakfast and a little bit of networking time. From 9 to 9:40, you have your formal program where you're teaching them some incredibly valuable best practices and topics for who they are and what someone like that in that particular job role in that particular company is top of mind for them. You know that because you did your persona research. You can make it incredibly interactive. It's a relatively small group. Open it up for Q&A, and for anyone that's interested afterwards, you take them on a tour around your facility. Lather, rinse, repeat. As long as you are providing a lot of value, as long as you're educating and building trust, as long as there's good chemistry, this can be fantastic for building and nurturing pipeline. Even better, it's a great way to start meeting other stakeholders from that same company, where you start to meet other people from that decision committee. Because when they register, you say, gee, it's great to see that you registered for our upcoming breakfast seminar on cybersecurity best practices for IT executives and mid-market manufacturing and media companies. But we know when it comes to cybersecurity, it truly takes a village. There's typically people involved from network operations, from help desk, from engineering, what have you. So with that in mind, who else from your team, who else from your company would benefit from attending? Simply hit the forward button, add a thought or two on why this matters, and we know the teams that learn together grow together. And the simple little email marketing that you've been able to do for 20 years, you'd be surprised, one, how many companies are not doing that, and two, how crazy effective it can be to get 2, 3, 4 people from the same company registering and attending. Again, these are free events. You're never going to get 100% attendance rate. But the idea here is that by having 2, 3, 4 people from the same company attending an in-person event together, they're learning together. You're proactively driving alignment. And if you provide a lot of value when you invite them to next month's event and next month's and next month's event, you'll not only get a lot of the same repeat people, which builds the know, like, and trust even faster, but you'll start to see that they bring more people from their team with them. So much to the point where it wouldn't surprise me if by month 3 or 4, half of the room is filled with 5 or 6 people from the same company, to the point where one of them takes you aside and says, like, this is a third of our team. Why don't you just come into our event? We're having an all hands next Friday and present this topic so everyone sees this. Like, fantastic, great idea. So that's playbook number 1. Playbook number 2, that's for people that are local, that can drive to your facility within 30 or 60 minutes. And don't get faked out. I know the data center industry has done a fantastic job with convincing you that you need to be at events with hundreds of people or thousands of people to have productive conversations for lead gen and opportunity generation, everything like that. And it can work, with emphasis on can, if there's really good alignment between your ideal client profile and their demographics. But a lot of times there's not. So if you take your ideal client profile on the right-hand side of your screen and you take their media kit on the left-hand side of the screen, I want you to see what you think the match rate is going to be based on last year's demographics and this year. If it's not an especially high match rate, you may have what we call like a needle in a haystack kind of problem. You have the opposite scenario when you're hosting your own events. And obviously, it's way less expensive to host an event in your own facility where you don't have travel, your team doesn't travel, you're not paying a small fortune for the booth and all the stuff that goes in the booth and everything. So because of that, you can do a lot more of these, 12, 24 of these over the course of the year. You know, it's not like it costs you to rent your own conference room. What are you talking about? Bringing in some bagels and pastries or some pizza and deli if it's a lunch event or something like that? Minuscule in the whole scheme of things for getting access to multiple stakeholders, perfect stakeholders from your target account list. And that's the key with all of this, is instead of having this massive loss factor by trying to edge your way, elbow your way into someone else's event, when it's your own event, let's say for argument's sake, there's 200 companies or 500 individuals on your target account list. You invite them, and you know with a pretty high degree of certainty that most of the people that you've invited to your event that are attending your event are nearly perfect matches for your ideal client profile because they're on your target account list. So don't get faked out. You can have fantastic events results with 10, 20, 30 people in the room. So these are the people. We're talking about people that can attend locally. Always record these events. You may, for people that are uncomfortable asking specific questions, you can tell them you'll edit that kind of stuff out. But what you'll tend to find, it's very rare to get 100% attendance rate. But what is very common is that multiple people that are in the room have coworkers, bosses, colleagues who should have been there but weren't. And they'll say, can I get a copy of your slides? Even better, I can send you the slides and I can send you the recording. And the recordings are fantastic as well for repurposing a dozen different ways from your YouTube channel, gated content, chopping them up in pieces, doing shorts, doing carousels, blog posts, email newsletters, the whole 9 yards. So in addition to the people that can attend locally, co-location data centers often have long distance relationships. It may be as little as 20% of your client base, but it can be a significant 15, 20% of your client base of people that want a colo facility in your area, but they're not a server hugger. They don't need to be able to get there relatively quickly. They're picking your particular area, however, because for governance reasons or latency reasons or whatever reasons, or they're moving, they're planning on setting up a facility nearby in the next 6, 12, 18 months, whatever it is, or they just simply have a lot of clients in your area. So they want space in a facility like yours, but it's not practical for them to drive 15, 20 minutes, 35 minutes, whatever it is, to come to your breakfast seminar. So what do? You take the exact same slides, the exact same content for the exact same buyer persona that's not geographically convenient, and you run the same series as a webinar, as a live stream with the exact same idea, inviting people from your target account list that where it's just not practical for them to be able to attend in person. It's a little hard to send the bagel or the slice of pizza over the Zoom, but we saw at the height of the pandemic, people getting creative with doing other things like that if they feel the need to do that with food, but you really most of the time don't. What the biggest value you're providing to most of the people that are attending is helping them do their job better and introducing them to best practices about how other people in a very similar job role in a very similar company of a very similar size in a very similar region are addressing these exact same digital infrastructure issues, governance issues, backup and disaster recovery issues, AI issues, transformation issues, whatever it is that's top of mind for them at that particular time. So you basically run the same event virtually, record as well. Again, never going to get that 100% attendance rate. Actually, if you do, there's something bizarre kind of edge case with the whole thing. But yeah, always record, always repurpose. And again, the whole idea is taking your internal subject matter experts and positioning them in a way that uses that expertise as a way to educate and build trust with your prioritized buyer personas in these target accounts. Now, kind of the twist with all of this that a lot of people don't realize is if you can get your account executives, if you can get your marketers, if you can get your account managers, if you can get your solutions engineers, if you can get your own internal team members to get involved in these events as subject matter experts, game-changing impact for the positioning and the relationship they have with prospects and clients. Because instead of your team members chasing your prospects and begging for time on their calendar, it's a completely flipped context because they see your team members as subject matter experts now and trusted advisors and consultants and teachers, and perhaps some of them are thought leaders. Now, what about some of the more junior members on your team that may not have a lot of expertise to offer, at least for now, for the next couple of years? There's a place for them as well to be actively involved in these meetings. They are the introducers. They're the people checking people in at the door. They are the moderators. The interesting part is you can also invite outside subject matter experts. They don't have to be full-time employees of your company. They could be contractors that you work with. They could be your channel partners. They could be your vendors that you work with that have subject matter experts. You're just bringing this together. This is the conference model. So in a perfect ideal scenario, I'd probably recommend that 50-75% of the people that are speaking at your events over the course of the year are full-time members of your team. But there's no reason on earth why you can't invite some of your clients to speak or be on panels or interview them live, whatever provides a lot of value, like a panel, to your attendees that are there. So get creative about how you close this gap on putting together this amazing series of small, intimate, highly personal events to help move the needle. So when it comes to building brand awareness, this is by far and away my favorite playbook for co-location data centers. In a lot of ways, co-location data centers are getting squeezed in the same way that web hosting companies got squeezed badly 10 years ago. In other words, this differentiation that you're doing is no longer a nice to have. This is survival. This is incredibly important if you want to get out of the vendor box and stay out of the vendor box, because we're already seeing on low-end co-location, some of the big to mid-size operators are starting to basically get rid of salespeople on the low-end commoditized products and make those products available as self-sign-up and self-onboarding on their websites, being sold kind of like e-commerce style. We've even seen some of the huge data center operators do this in categories like bare metal. Basically, what they're looking at is the unit economics of an average sale that this particular team was bringing in. And if they're not terribly impressed by the size of the deal relative to cost of acquisition, in most cases, they're looking at, it's a little bit of work to set this up for self sign up and self onboarding, a little bit of a financial investment. But that's what a lot of buyers want. So we're trying to make sure that we pave a way for your future where you're not just seen as a glorified order taker anymore, because the website can do that better. You're not just seen as someone that answers questions that can be answered in an FAQ or an explainer video or by the real looming threat here. What we're talking about is the generative AI tools, where people are having conversations with ChatGPT and Gemini and Claude and Perplexity and Copilot instead of having conversations with you. And that's not good. So we need to figure out a way to get you back into the room. The best way to get you back into the room is to reposition yourself, give yourself a makeover so you're not seen by your traditional job title anymore, but your prospects and clients truly see you as a consultant, a teacher, a trusted advisor about anything and everything that's relevant to their biggest goals and challenges, which is, again, why we see so many colocation operators starting to specialize by industry. They've been, for a while, been specializing by account size, splitting up between SMB, small, medium-sized business, mid-market, and enterprise. Now, in addition to that split, we're also seeing splits at the vertical level, at the industry level. So in the example that we started with earlier, so if you spent your career the past 10, 15 years working in media and telecommunications, and you come work for a colocation operator, all of a sudden you have a fantastic list of contacts, dozens, hundreds, maybe thousands of people that you've met over the years, enormous institutional knowledge, and a lot of the prospects and clients that you meet with on a regular basis see you as a peer as opposed to a vendor. So they let their guard down and you have a better opportunity to educate and build trust and add value. So for a colocation data center that is looking to build brand awareness in today's hyper-competitive, always on, moving incredibly fast marketplace, that's the basic playbook for how to build a colocation data center brand awareness play in today's marketplace. So what do we have up next? What is our next question for today? By the way, if you're getting good value from what we've covered so far, make sure to hit the like button on whatever platform that you're watching. And if you have an idea for a topic or a question or a challenge that you'd like to see addressed in an upcoming show, be sure to leave that in the comments as well. Next up, how does a data center software-defined infrastructure provider compete with better funded VC-backed, venture-backed firms? How does a data center software-defined infrastructure provider compete with better funded venture-backed firms? So what's interesting, there's like a little bit of an emperor's new clothes thing going on here. Is a lot of small startup-y, small companies in this space, in this category, software-defined infrastructure provider, the ones that would probably be most intimidated by better funded VC-backed firms would probably be on the smaller side. They're companies with a few dozen employees, maybe 50, 100, 200 employees at the absolute most, where there's a grass is greener mentality. But the grass is not always greener. And for anyone that's ever worked for a VC-backed, a venture-backed firm, especially a company that is at the relatively early stages like Series A or Series B, it's very difficult for the leadership of the company to focus 100% of their efforts on being client-centric or partner-centric, because the reality is, especially at the early stages of the company, there's usually new board members who have joined who are insistent on putting their fingerprints all over the company and installing their own experts, regardless of whether those experts are contextually relevant to this company stage and the problems that they're navigating. What we see happening very, very often at Series A and Series B companies and SaaS and digital infrastructure and across the broader ecosystem is board members, especially board members that have worked predominantly for larger, well-known companies. They've worked for like AWS and Microsoft and IBM and Cisco. They've always worked for companies that are blue chip names. They largely want to heavily favor hiring team members at these companies who also worked for huge, well-known brand names, on the feeling that it is a safer choice. If you've ever heard the expression going back decades of nobody ever got fired for buying IBM, that mentality largely still exists. Ironically, that was my first IT industry job in college. in my early 20s with doing sales and marketing for IBM Academic Information Systems. But that mentality largely still exists today. It's probably not purely limited to IBM. The equivalent for the data center industry would be nobody ever got fired for buying Equinix, or nobody ever got fired for choosing Digital Realty or something like that, the huge incumbent brands. And because board members that are installed by venture capital so frequently puts these kinds of companies on a pedestal, they tend to overwhelmingly favor those, even for startup-y kind of companies. And the challenge is, let's say, for example, you were an account manager for a particular location of Digital Realty for 3, 4, 5 years. And because of that, they think for sure it would be a cakewalk for you to walk in and be the chief commercial officer or the head of a vice president of account management or something like that at a much, much higher level than you ever operated in a much smaller company. The challenge, however, is unless you happen to be an account manager at Digital Realty, 20 years ago, when they were still a relatively new startup-y kind of company, chances are by the time you arrive there, they were already on playbook iteration 117, and you had a massive amount of internal support and a very well-respected global brand that you could lean on. So the kind of challenges that you faced as an account manager working as one of 300 or 1,300 account managers or whatever it is very, very different than when you were hired to be the first account manager or the first team lead or first vice president or director in charge of a handful of account managers, because your playbook just isn't built. In many cases, at that early stage of a company, product market fit, go-to-market fit, channel partner market fit, those things aren't even totally locked in yet. So it's a very, very different kind of context. So when you think that the grass is greener, when you have this envy, when you have these insecurities about better funded venture capital firms, just recognize that many times venture capital firms are very, very distracted because they've gone on these scavenger hunts trying to find the perfect talent that a lot of times is a complete mismatch relative to the kind of more scrappy, wearing 20 different hats, doing 15 different kinds of jobs kind of person that's often way more of a better fit, a way more appropriate fit for an earlier stage kind of company. So for a software-defined infrastructure provider that's competing with these better funded VC-backed firms, just recognize they're very distracted. What you can do to better compete with them is get a lot more crisp about the value that you're providing to your specific clients. One is from a CEO perspective, from a CTO perspective, your CEO, your CTO, your chief product, really, really dial in your value proposition and who that ideal client profile is, and pick your battles for where you can compete and win right now, where you have a competitive advantage. The tighter you can make that ideal client profile in terms of where your ideal clients are located, how big or small their companies are, and the big and small is a big one as well. Larger companies tend to not be great with smaller companies, especially early on. If you're in a position where as a smaller company, you can provide crazy levels of service to your smaller clients and make them feel really special, a lot of times that can be a really big competitive advantage. It's not always possible to do this at a scalable level, and you need to think through what your minimums are, and that aligns with like the bottom end of the range of the employee headcount and your ideal client profile. You also should get realistic too on the upper end of the range, the top end of the range of employee headcount in your ideal client profile. Like when a client gets to a certain size, at which point are their software-defined infrastructure needs so complicated that we just can't deliver on that today? By being very self-aware on both the bottom end of that range and the top end of the range, you can have an enormous competitive advantage over a VC-backed competitor who is probably in a growth at all cost mode and is throwing ideas of unit economics completely out the window. And again, it depends on how capital efficient they're being forced to be at any given time, and there'll be for sure ebbs and flows depending on the availability of capital, depending on the business model category they're in. But just to understand, there's always opportunities to outcompete VC-backed competitors by getting tighter on that ideal client profile, by getting tighter on what you provide for them, and most of all, getting closer to those folks. Spending more time visiting them in person, doing more frequent check-ins, making sure that you're really understand the difference between the decision makers and the users and the different stakeholders' perspectives, being really, really on top of the live chats and support tickets and any bug issues or open issues that come up in onboarding sessions and various check-in sessions like your account managers do. And I would argue that there's even a big opportunity relative to the VC-backed firms to start driving alignment and showing value even before they become paying clients. So this is the argument for going all in on education and trust building, not just in the late stages of the journey, but in the very early stages of the journey as well. If you've been following me for a while, you know I'm a huge fan of educational webinars and educational events. If you're able to put together something like Software Defined Infrastructure University or something like that, or Academy, where you can provide this fantastic curriculum for your 2 or 3 most important kinds of stakeholders with very well structured units and examples and methodologies and best practices. And you can wrap this around a certification exam and credential that you do. This is how small companies are able to punch way, way above their weight class by getting closer to the point of value and demonstrating that value and changing the positioning so you're not commoditized, so you really have a unique point of differentiation with companies that may have very much deeper pockets. The reality is it's also very common in much the same way that VCs tend to overweight, tend to overemphasize the logo hire. You know how you love putting logos on your website because it's social proof? Well, a lot of board members love the logo hire. They love to have someone with that brand name credential in their last job, even if it's a complete mismatch. Another blind spot that a lot of VCs have is they love to see their portfolio companies go to a conference and buy a ridiculously large booth on that expo floor and make an enormous splash. The challenge with that is there's so many times where a relatively early stage company doesn't have perfect clarity into their product market fit and go to market fit. And that's really important for having a really crisp ideal client profile. And your trade show investments are either set up for success or set up for the opposite success, depending on how well matched that conference's demographics are to your ideal client profile. And what we're looking for in terms of demographics is who attended last year and who do they think is going to attend this year. And again, bear in mind, these are typically not audited declarations with the demographics. It's just basically what's sitting in their PDF, what's in their media kit. But look at who was actually there last year and look at who they think is going to be there this year and see how good of a match rate you get with your ideal client profile and your target accounts. If you get a very high match rate, okay, you're on the right track, but we still need to figure out a way to educate and build trust. And typically expo floors are not the best way to educate and build trust at conferences. So there's a whole bunch of things that come into play, but yeah, it's entirely possible that a company that's just raised a Series A or just raised a Series B is going to go, I don't want to say blow it or flush down the drain or whatever it is, but it's very common to find hundreds of thousands or literally low 7 figures or your local currency equivalent being invested on a handful of conferences in a very do or die kind of very high stakes campaign that may or may not pan out. And at the absolute minimum, it's diverting an enormous amount of capital. And even more importantly, for a relatively small company, it's diverting an enormous amount of team attention. Because when a company is investing 50,000, 100,000, 300,000 in a conference, whatever it is, you can be sure that the headcount is going along with there as well. So at the minimum, there's 1 or more team members who are working on that nearly full-time for several weeks. There's multiple team members who a couple of days before are doing the prep for that conference. And then there's the exhausting 14, 16, 18-hour days at the conference. And there's the couple of days when you come back from the conference on getting caught up and dealing with all that. So these are multi-week commitments for several team members. There's a lot at stake for getting this right versus not. And a lot of times when you have a raise, you're looking to go as fast as possible, which doesn't always align with being as careful as possible with the precision on these kinds of investments. So those 2 things alone, getting tighter on that ICP and educating and building trust throughout the full journey and avoiding wasting cycles on big conferences that may or may not align well with the composition of your target account list with your ICP can go a long way to helping a company that's providing software-defined infrastructure for being able to compete with better funded VC firms. And I think over time, one of the best ways to approach this long-term is to recognize that once you understand who your buyer personas are and where they're located, people don't learn during business hours, don't just learn during business hours. So what that means is being able to provide self-serve resources that people can go through on their own time at the weird times when they actually have time to learn more about their goals and challenges that align with their core responsibilities with their job. To the extent that you have these resources available at weird times for them to go through, which may be 2:00 in the morning, their local time, or 2:00 on a Sunday afternoon on a holiday weekend or something like that, when no one from your sales team would be conceivably available, when there's no expo, when there's no webinars, when there's no in-person events going on. To the extent that you have these self-serve resources, a lot of times you can engage in lead generation in a field where there's no one else generating leads. You can engage in a lot of sales cycle acceleration by proactively educating and building trust about the topics that you know are top of mind for them because you've done their homework. So understanding that full journey, getting in early and often is incredibly important. Think about 25 to 30 touch points between complete stranger and purchase decision. I think there's many, many opportunities like that in those 2 or 3 different kinds of strategies, those 2 or 3 different kind of plays for a company that's selling software-defined infrastructure to really outsmart, to outgun that better funded VC-backed firm. So get really clear on who they are, what's going on in their world, knowing who that first and second most important persona is, and just completely obsessing about how you can add value for that person's professional development and learning development. So they're highly motivated to want to spend a lot of time with you, learning and growing with you, and highly motivated to want to bring their colleagues or team members along with them as they attend your in-person events, as they attend their webinars. So you're proactively driving alignment throughout the full journey, not just scrambling at the end. So those are the 2 or 3 things that I'd be thinking about for a data center software-defined infrastructure provider that wants to compete with better funded venture-backed firms. Okay, what is up next? Our next question. So we're staying here in the technology part of the data center ecosystem with this next question, and we're looking specifically at how a telecommunications sales professional, how a telecommunications account executive or an AE can get meetings with the right person at the right time. How does a data center telecommunications account executive get meetings with the right person at the right time? That is a fantastic question. And it's never been more challenging, and there's never been more at stake to getting this right. So the challenge with data center telecommunications is, for starters, we need to dial in where your precise area of expertise is. Because when I speak with go-to-market professionals from telecommunications companies, I see some spread pretty thin. What do I mean by spread pretty thin? In that, because they tend to be a smaller company, or this happened through acquisitions, they're either they individually or their team is simultaneously working on voice deals and data deals. And it's such a different context. It's such a different business model. It's such a different set of stakeholders that I think there's enormous value first in laying the groundwork for here and saying that if you're working in telecommunications specifically for data centers, nearly all of what you're going to spend your time on is on the data side, as opposed to UC and voice and VoIP and SIP and other things that are unique and specific to, or at least typically thought of in terms of voice as opposed to data. So getting really dialed into the data side of data center telecommunications. So the account executive that wants to get meetings with the right person at the right time, I think what's really important is you don't get to decide what the right time is, the buyer does. And in order for us to be the one that they are willing and able and want to talk to when they hit that point where they're ready for a sales conversation, by definition, the only way to get the timing right is to be in there early and often. And the often is where most people typically drop the ball. In other words, the challenge with all of this is in a self-driven buyer's journey, just recognize that most of your buyers for data center telecommunications want to spend as little time as possible with a salesperson. If it was possible to spend zero time with a salesperson, they would probably do it. But recognizing that data centers, IXs, meet me rooms, carrier neutrality, this is still pretty complicated stuff. They benefit from having access to an expert advisor. And that's the challenge with all of this, is we need to think of how we can position you as the account executive as less of an account executive and more as a trusted consultant, as a subject matter expert, as a trusted advisor, maybe even a thought leader. So when it comes to anything and everything about how this particular individual needs to address their biggest goals with data center telecommunications and address their biggest nagging challenges, we have to be the magic resource that is able to provide enormous clarity to cut through the confusion. And recognize that your competition for being able to get to those great conversations with the right person at the right time is not just limited to people that do what you do at other companies. It's not just limited to other account executives at other companies. You are competing for attention against marketplaces like ConnectBase. Ben Edmonds' company would be a fantastic example of that in and around telecommunications. You're also competing with the very generative AI tools that have sent this industry into massive overdrive over the last couple of years. What does that mean? Well, 10 years ago, your future clients, your prospects would be willing to meet with you for like the second half of their journey, through the second half of the research and decision-making process. 10 years ago, there was widely cited research from CEB, the corporate executive board that's now owned by Gartner, that found that 56% of the typical journey was over before sales contact. So when you did things right, you were still in there for the final 44%. Not ideal, but not too bad. You could still work with that. 10 years of digital transformation, all of the so many more baby boomers retiring over the last 10 years, more Gen Z and millennials in decision-making roles, and tens of millions of people working from home at the start of the 2020s and continuing to have these hybrid arrangements. We're now in a place where that 56% number has jumped all the way to 83%. Gartner, 83% of a typical journey, researching, comparing options, and evaluating pricing now happens before vendor contact, now happens before you get to meet a prospect as an account executive. And wow. So, I mean, even if we do everything right, we're only in there for the final 17%. Yep, we're only in there for the final 17%. So in that world, we can't afford to sit back anymore and be reactive. We need to be proactive. And unfortunately, because they're more sales allergic than ever, just trying to do cold outreach to try to get a meeting on their calendar, to try to understand their needs and analyzing their needs is not going to cut it anymore. Because when it comes to those basic questions, they don't need to talk to you anymore. They're much happier talking to ChatGPT and Claude and Perplexity and Gemini and Copilot. They're not getting put through a prospecting process. They're not getting put through a qualification process. They don't have to wait. They can get instant gratification. So in other words, if you thought 10 years ago that self-serve answers coming from Google and coming from you watching YouTube videos and asking questions on LinkedIn was tough to compete with, we're completely next level, because they're still doing a lot of that. Actually, a lot of the traditional Google searchers are going to the generative AI tools. But just recognize the LLMs, the large language models, are so ridiculously powerful of being able to answer all of these questions that typically account executives were the last line of, hey, I'll hold back that information. So the prospect has to talk to me to get that kind of information. So yeah, it's tough competition. The way we get you back in is they need to see you more as the consultant, the teacher, the trusted advisor, and the subject matter expert. And that by definition means extreme levels of specialization in nearly all cases, as a key part of differentiation. And the smaller your company is, the less of a global brand that you have, the less brand equity that you can have to lean on in a company, the more important it is for you to build up your own personal professional brand. So it's so obvious to your prospects and clients that you're adding ridiculous amounts of value that they're not going to be able to figure out on their own. So that's the early part of intercepting those prospects in the early and the middle part of their journey. But for the right time, it's really a matter of training them, of indoctrinating them, of showing them that you're providing such outrageous levels of value that when it comes to them finally being ready for that product related conversation, that decision stage conversation, that sales conversation, they know that you are the only one to turn to. And that usually is happening through a combination of multiple touch points, events, educational related touch points. So in this particular context, let's say, for example, that your core buyer persona is a VP of infrastructure, some kind of IT infrastructure company at a mid-market manufacturing or financial services company, and your secondary persona, maybe a channel partner or something like that, like a VAR, evaluated reseller, or managed service provider. For each of those segments, we need the customer insights to know their 5 or 6 biggest goals, their 5 or 6 biggest challenges that they've articulated in their own words. And we take those 10 or 12 topics, and once a month, we invite people from our ICP, our ideal client profile, from our target accounts, to an educational event that gives them amazing value on best practices about how to close the gap on addressing that goal, specifically for a person in that job role at a company in this geographic region, of a company of roughly that size in that particular industry. And the more hyper specific we are, the more it's like they're scrolling through and it's like you're literally grabbing them by the shirt collar into the screen by providing such ridiculous levels of relevancy for who they are and what they care about in their own words. And when we do this over and over again by addressing those 10 or 12 topics once a month over the next 10 or 12 months, we give them a reason to keep coming back. We give them a reason to bring their coworkers along with them, and we start to meet the rest of the decision committee. But most of all, we're ensuring that we get on the short list, and we're ensuring that we stay on the short list, because they're learning so much from you and your client-facing team members that there's no reason for them to turn anywhere else to learn about anything and everything that's relevant to telecommunications to help them do their job better. So we stay on the short list. When we do this at an elite level, your competitors start to disappear from that short list because there's not a lot of need, there's not a lot of time for them to look elsewhere. They're getting what they need from you. You are the single point of contact. You're providing consulting services that's so valuable that as recently as 5 or 10 years ago, it likely would have been a paid consulting engagement. It's just that this is the new table stakes for getting you in early and often. And the often is so incredibly important. It's nearly impossible to get the timing right. Everyone's like, well, can I get access to intent data? Can I get access to trigger events? Can I get access to? You can. However, at the end of the day, know, like, and trust still has to happen. You still have to be able to educate and build trust. And unless you have the luxury of working for a Fortune 1000 brand, your professional brand, your ability to do this at scale with multiple people from this company is going to largely predict how well you're going to do as an account executive in getting meetings with the right person at the right time. Because when you have that proximity, and when you keep getting in front of them in a way that it's not about getting them on your deals board, but instead helping them do their job better, that's what makes them want to reach out to you. So that's the number one strategy that I would focus on as a data center telecommunications account executive, a data center telecommunications AE that wants to get meetings with the right person at the right time. That brings us to our fourth question that we'll be addressing in this week's Data Center Go-to-Market Sales and Marketing Q&A, which we'll address in a few moments right after we take a real quick break for a message from our sponsor. If you're enjoying this week's show, be sure to hit the like button.
Data Center Go-to-Market Sales and Marketing Q&A is sponsored by DCSMI, elevating the role of sales, marketing, and go-to-market GTM professionals in the growth of the data center industry. To stay informed about upcoming episodes, subscribe to the Data Center Sales and Marketing newsletter on the DCSMI website at www.dcsmi.com. Again, that's www.dcsmi.com. Now, back to Data Center Go-to-Market Sales and Marketing Q&A.
Hey there, Joshua Feinberg from DCSMI, the Data Center Sales and Marketing Institute, and you're tuned into the Data Center Go-to-Market Sales and Marketing Q&A show, our weekly live show, where we address a handful of the biggest sales and marketing challenges that we're hearing about from all over the data center ecosystem. And speaking of challenges, if you have an idea for a topic or a question or a challenge that you'd like to see us address in an upcoming show, be sure to leave that in the comments wherever you're watching, and we'll add that to the consideration queue as a possible topic for an upcoming episode. Okay, so what is up next? Next question is, how can a digital infrastructure provider generate quality leads? How can a provider of digital infrastructure generate quality leads? I often talk about the idea of intentional lead generation, and I think that's especially important here. What is intentional lead generation? Well, go to market professionals, sales, marketers, account managers, product folks, channel folks, even executives, to a large degree, use the word lead with a lot of potential meanings. So, for example, a marketer may view a lead as someone that has had their badge scanned at a booth that you've had at a conference. They may also view a lead as someone that's downloaded an ebook or a special report or gone through a quiz or a calculator on your website. And to a certain degree, that is a lead. A lead could also be a hand curated list of individuals that work at target accounts. Again, in some of those contexts, in the earlier contexts, they know who your company is, but they haven't yet expressed interest in engaging with you or learning more. And in the other scenario, they may not even be aware that your company exists. They didn't decide to be a target account of yours, and they may have no idea that they're a target account of yours, let alone all the people that you've added to the list. So all of those could be considered leads, but just understand when it comes to sales development reps, SDRs and business development reps, BDRs and account executives, when they think of leads, they're usually thinking of sales opportunities. A sales opportunity is typically someone that has really good fit for your lead qualification criteria against your ideal client profile, your ICP. And in addition to meeting that basic criteria, they're showing some degree of interest in learning more about what it is that your company does. So we often talk about, like, whether you're thinking about Venn diagrams or an X and Y axis, we have two different ideas going on here. We have the idea that a lead could be a fit for who, and we're not talking about fit like taking a temper tantrum. We're talking about a fit like a match. They're a really good match for who you think your ideal client is based on where they're located, how big or small their company is, the industry that they're located in, and potentially this person is even a match at the contact level, at the individual level, as opposed to at the company level. So they're a fit based on all of that. However, until they've shown signs of being later on in the journey, all we really know is what we actually know. Like, for example, that they signed up to download a special report, or they visited a booth at a conference, or you picked them up on a lead and scrape kind of thing because they happen to work at a target account. All we know is what we actually know. And at that stage, they're nearly all cases, none of those folks are what we consider a sales opportunity. A sales opportunity usually means, if you've ever heard the idea of a hand raiser, that's a very obvious sales opportunity in most cases. If there's a match at the ICP, at the ideal client profile, the account level, a hand raiser is someone that has filled out a form on your website that says, I want to talk to sales. And in some cases, it may be dressed up a little better. Hopefully it's dressed up a little better. Like, I want to schedule a tour. I want to book a demo. I want to learn more. That's a hand raiser. The in-between part of that is having a known contact that's taken an action that's signaling that they're showing signs of high intent, even if they haven't explicitly filled out a form that says, I want to talk to someone. This could be a known contact visiting a high intent page on your website, like a pricing page or a case studies page. This could be matching up a known contact with third-party intent data that's going to be increasingly hard to come by because of all the privacy protections that are coming into play. But either way, we know they're showing signs of being interested in your category as opposed to being interested in just the topic or the reason that original lead was generated. So we first need to dispel the idea that we first need to drive some alignment across different members of your go-to-market team, because recognize that sales professionals think of leads as being a lot more fully baked than marketers do in many cases. So it's super important to make sure that you're aligned about the terminology that you use in your CRM and your customer relationship management system, and think about when you're going to hand off leads from marketing to sales, when they're going to get handed back or stay with sales, when they get nurtured. And it's usually a combination of 4 quadrants of looking at, like, a combination of fit and interest, where if they're a perfect fit and they're showing high interest, they go to sales immediately. If they're a terrible fit and they're showing low interest, they get basically free resources. If they're a great fit, but they're not showing any interest yet, they go in priority to get nurtured. Perfect nurturing would be using email marketing and event marketing to try to accelerate those leads. And then there's some cases too where you have a company that's a terrible fit, but they're showing high interest. And the conventional wisdom with that is if you think you can help them, you don't really invest in the sales process, but you go kind of an order taker, self-serve kind of mode, or next closest thing to self-serve mode. So there's really 4 possibilities on how to address the quality leads, but quality is very subjective until you actually get what the definition of what quality is down on paper. And it could be as simple as a Google Doc that just basically says, this is our ideal client profile. They're going to be located in this region. They're going to be from a company that's this big or small. They tend to be from one of these 2 or 3 different kinds of industries. If they're from this industry, they're instantly disqualified. They're not going to be a fit. From there, you can build a target account list. And from there, you can find individuals in those companies that align with who you found historically to be the perfect kind of contact person in that kind of account, who the primary and secondary and perhaps even the tertiary person is on that account, who has the biggest economic impact on that account, both pre and post purchase. Typically at the account level, you can figure this out by just simply looking at your own website or your CRM and figuring out like what your best clients, best accounts tend to have in common. For the individual stakeholders, the prioritized buyer personas in those accounts, usually you'll be digging around in your CRM, talking to your account executives, your account managers, your sales development reps, and trying to figure out like, okay, what is the job function? What's the job role? What are the responsibilities of the person that's usually the most influential on this kind of engagement? Who's the second most important? And what do we know about that person? And what do we know about that person usually kickstarts the buyer persona research process, but most of the buyer persona research process hopefully involves you getting direct information directly from that person in the form of in-person interviews, video interviews, surveys, studying how they show up on social media, how they show up on search and various other kinds of interactions to get the consensus on what they need to achieve and what they're struggling with most. And all of that will help you put together a lead generation strategy that's client-centric, that revolves around providing a lot of value to prospects and future clients based on problems that they know they have. Not problems that you'd like them to have, but problems that they know that they actually have, that they've articulated to in their own words. So like, for example, let's say you're selling digital infrastructure to someone that has the word infrastructure in their job title. They're like an IT infrastructure executive from a mid-market manufacturing company. And you've determined that the number one challenge for this particular buyer persona is they're concerned about data integrity and cybersecurity. So because data integrity and cybersecurity have come up high on their list of challenges, or maybe even on their list of goals, more than likely your best performing headline on a website page for that particular buyer persona, on a landing page for a lead generation offer, will revolve around talking about, in their own words, how they've articulated what they're trying to achieve with improving data integrity and improving cybersecurity kinds of protections. So the idea is getting in early and often. And it's not just about, again, it's so important to recognize and respect that your buyers for now, the world we now live in, they want to just do a ton of research before they get to you. So in order for us to get in early and often, by definition, we're going to need lead generation offers, not just for each prioritized buyer persona. We need lead generation offers that carry us through a relationship throughout the journey. So at the minimum, we need an early stage, a mid stage, and a late stage lead generation offer for each of our prioritized buyer personas. What should those lead generation offers be? Again, their words that come out of their mouths. If you can't get it out of their mouths, at the absolute minimum, study their LinkedIn profiles, study what shows up on search footprints, study what they say when they speak at webinars, when they speak at conferences, when they're interviewed at podcasts, when they write guest posts, when they write blogs. All of that, when they're quoted in news releases, all of that should give you some insight as to how they self-describe their biggest goals and their biggest challenges. So that's a big part of your lead generation strategy, is having a way to get in early and often. I'm also extremely partial for using an educational event strategy for lead generation and sales cycle acceleration, where you're providing your most important buyer personas a significant reason to want to spend a lot of time with you in a learning and development and professional development kind of context for helping to close the gaps on addressing their biggest goals, addressing their biggest challenge, solving some of their biggest challenges, and early and often. The often part, how this comes into play in practice, is let's say you have 10 or 12 goals and challenges that you discover. There's 10 or 12 months in the year. Once a month, part 1, part 2, part 3, address one of these goals and challenges at a time, a very client-centric way of educating and building trust, whether it's in person and like a breakfast seminar, lunch and learn kind of format, symposium kind of format. If your clients are more long distance, you could run these as a webinar series, but the goal is to provide enough tangible value by focusing on the biggest goals and the biggest challenges that these digital infrastructure executives have, that your internal subject matter experts, even potentially your channel partners or vendors subject matter experts, can help by providing amazingly helpful, amazingly useful, relevant best practices for who they are and what's going on in their world. Not what you'd like to be going on in their world, but what's actually going on in their world. And the cool part is, when this is this hyper precise, you don't need large numbers of registrants and attendees to really start to move the needle. A lot of people get messed up in the thinking with all the big conferences in this industry that you need to be in front of hundreds or thousands of people. No, if you have 100 people on your target account list and you get 20 people from those target accounts showing up at your educational events, you can have a significant amount of pipeline from a significant amount of people that are in the room, because it's so more hype. The attendee list and the content and the events and the value and everything is so much more specific to who they are and what they care about. And most of all, you have their undivided attention for 45 minutes or whatever the event duration is. You're not sharing that. You're not competing with it with 5 other concurrent tracks of the conference, or you're lucky if you get 90 seconds of them coming by and visiting a booth or something like that. We have their undivided attention in an education and trust building kind of context. And when we start to notice multiple people from the same company attending and learning together, truly, truly beautiful things happen with lead generation and sales cycle acceleration. So in terms of a digital infrastructure provider, generating quality leads, I think it's very, very important to get as client-centric as possible. So you're providing value, touch points, premium content, educational events, coupled together with that lead generation opportunity. Remember, none of your prospects and clients wake up in the morning and say, gee, it would be a great thing if I could become a lead today for a digital infrastructure provider. It would be great if I got 50 cold calls today. 500 spam messages in my inbox. Those would all be amazingly awesome. No, they wake up knowing that there's something that they have to figure out to help them do their job better. They know that there's an objective and key result that they need to chip away at. They know that there's something that's driving them nuts, that's causing their team a lot of stress and compromising the ability to unplug on vacations. And they know all of these things that are going on in their head. Your goal is to get inside of their head and figure out what these are and be able to proactively show that you have educational events content that can help them address these specific goals. And the better job you do with this, the more likely it is that they want to spend time with you, learning from your experts about how they can better do their job and address some of these big goals and challenges. And when you do this right, they tend to bring their coworkers along with them. So you start to meet multiple members from the decision committee, and they start to bring progressively more and more people to the point where they're like, hey, there's 5 of us from our team here. Why don't you just come in? We're having an all hands next Friday. Why don't you just come in and present to the whole company, present to our whole department? And like, well, it'd be awesome. So this is how to generate high quality leads. Get out of that vendor box. Don't allow yourself to be limited by your clients and prospects thinking of you by your traditional like job title, but instead put a lot of thought and effort into how you can look a lot more like a teacher, a consultant, a subject matter expert, a trusted advisor, maybe even a thought leader when it comes to anything and everything that's relevant to helping do their job better. That's a leading indicator that they're going to need help with digital infrastructure in the coming weeks and in the coming months. This is a long game. It's incredibly important that we get you in early enough to be able to shape that criteria, because if you do not get in early, someone else is getting in early and someone else is shaping the criteria that they're going to use to ultimately make their decision about what they're going to do with infrastructure. So my call to action for you is, let's think about how we can get you in early and get you in as often as possible with the perfect prioritized buyer personas primary and secondary buyer personas in your target accounts. So that's how a digital infrastructure provider can generate quality leads. If you're getting great value from this week's Data Center Go-to-Market Sales and Marketing Q&A show, make sure that you hit the like button on whatever platform you're watching. And if you have an idea for a topic or a question or a challenge that you think we should address in an upcoming show, be sure to leave that in the comments. Okay, so what is up next? What's our next question? So far this week, we've spent a lot of time talking about data center operators and data center technology kinds of companies that work in and around the data center ecosystem. We looked at co-location, we looked at software-defined infrastructure, we looked at telecommunications, we looked at digital infrastructure. Next question takes us to another part of the data center ecosystem. We're going to enter the facilities part of the data center ecosystem, specifically the energy segment within data center facilities. And this viewer, this reader, this wants to know how a data center energy efficiency consultancy can market and sell with the value proposition of getting kilowatts back and easier operations. How does a data center energy efficiency consultancy market and sell in a way that they're primarily dealing with getting kilowatts back for their clients and easier operations for their clients? That is a fantastic question. So what we're talking about here is a professional services firm that operates within the data center facilities part of the data center ecosystem. So by definition, most of their ideal clients, most of their target buyer personas are going to be in one or two kinds of business models. They're either going to be data center operators, like most commonly co-location or hyperscale providers, but there could also be edge modular and wholesale data center clients. Usually it would end up being for energy efficiency consultancy. You're probably talking mostly with co-location and hyperscale, maybe some edge providers, a little bit of wholesale, a little bit of modular. And in addition to the data center operators, you likely have a whole bunch of clients that are enterprises that have their own data centers, that own and operate their own data centers. So if there's two broad categories, data center operators and enterprises that have their own data centers, we have a pretty good idea of how we're going to define our ideal client profile. Energy efficiency, by definition, is relatively difficult to do long distance. You're almost certainly going to need some site visits. You can ultimately install equipment and sensors and everything that allows you to remotely monitor what's going on. But by definition, at least initially and on some kind of regular basis, you're likely going to need to do site visits. So the geographic part of your ideal client profile is going to more than likely be shaped by where you have geographic coverage, by where your employees, by where your contractors, by where your channel partners are located, where you can cost effectively deliver these energy efficiency professional services, energy efficiency consultancy services. In addition to that, you will likely know, based on your minimum levels of engagement and your team's capabilities, how big or small your best clients are. Depending on what your project minimums are, you may decide, for example, that a client needs to have, I don't know, at least 200 employees or at least 500 employees or something like that in order to be able to afford your minimums. More than likely, because you're dealing in energy, you probably have some pretty strong opinions too, based on the power capacity at that particular site, based on kilowatts. Just understand that most of the prospecting databases that you would likely use from an outbound perspective, from an advertising perspective, are not normalized segmenting based on kilowatts or megawatts or gigawatts, but instead are typically queryable based on the size of your client's company. So at some point, you'll need to sit down and figure out, based on your historical pattern matching, what is a 10 kilowatt, 50 kilowatt, whatever it is, where does that line up to in terms of your minimums, and where does that line up to in terms of the number of employees that a client would need to have? Conversely, can you really effectively provide these energy efficiency consulting services to huge multinational companies? In other words, General Electric, Microsoft, Equinix, Digital Realty, whatever, companies with thousands of employees, tens of thousands of employees, maybe hundreds of thousands of employees. Is your company in a position where you can provide these energy efficiency consulting services directly to them without working through a larger company as a subcontractor. If you can, more power to you. For sure, make sure that's in your ideal client profile. If there's some very practical limits where your ability to be effective falls off a cliff beyond 1,000 employees, beyond 5,000 employees, you're for sure going to want to have that in your ideal client profile, because that will impact what you're going to do with outbound prospecting, what you're going to do with ads, what you'd want to do with lead generation forms, and how you segment and filter within your CRM system to make sure that you're spending your time in the right places with cultivating professional services consulting opportunities for energy efficiency. So we've talked about the geographic part of marketing and selling. We've talked about the size, not necessarily the kilowatt size, but the employee headcount size as a proxy for budget, resources, affordability, for being able to afford you and being able to afford your company. Sometimes there's industries that are a good match better than others. But we also, depending on the company size, we need to get really clear about who the key people are at these accounts. Before we even do that, though, once we have that ideal client profile defined, you should be able to build out a target account list. This would power like what people often call account-based marketing, ABM, or account-based selling. This is a finite list of companies, usually depending on what you do and where you're located. It's usually anywhere from a couple dozen to maybe in some cases a few hundred companies. It's pretty rare that it's thousands of companies unless you're national or global. So it's a defined list of companies that you think would be a fantastic fit for working with your company, for hiring your company for energy efficiency consulting services. And that gives a lot of clarity and focus as to where you should invest your efforts with lead generation, with nurturing, with educating and building trust. And usually that account-based marketing motion is very conducive to outbound prospecting and running digital ads. So tools like LinkedIn Sales Navigator and LinkedIn Campaign Manager become incredibly relevant for small to mid-sized companies that are executing on this, even with relatively modest tech stack, relatively modest MarTech, and client acquisition budgets. So we've figured out what's going on at the company level. Now, what about the individual people that we need to market and sell to in these accounts? A lot of how granular your targeting is going to be with the individual people in these accounts will depend on their company size and your company size. If you're a relatively small company, and you're also selling to relatively small companies, let's say you're selling to predominantly to co-location operators with a few dozen employees, you're almost certainly going to need to go directly to the owner or the president or founder or CEO or equivalent, because the reality is when it comes to energy efficiency for a 30-person or 50-person colo company with 1 or 2 or 3 locations, almost everything like this is going to need to go past the owner's desk. They're going to be involved. As you get to mid-sized co-location operators and the large mid-sized co-location operators with hundreds of employees and 10, 20, 30 locations, energy efficiency may not be so top of mind that it's going all the way to the CEO level. You may be like there's a head of engineering or head of facilities or something like that. Sometimes this is addressed when you're developing out new properties, but sometimes it's ESG, sometimes it's more of a sustainability play with all of this. Sometimes it's even finance taking the lead when it comes to energy efficiency, because they feel they've been told by multiple board members, or they've heard from their peers, that their cost structure is just not competitive. So there's a lot of different stakeholders that may be interested in talking about energy efficiency issues when you get to a medium to large size data center operator. But it's smaller, again, your internal champion is almost certainly going to need to be at that C level, probably even the CEO, president, founder, owner, or equivalent. And it's only when you start to get to mid-low. Like, who would be mid-size in a US? Mid-size to large in the US, at least, this would be like QTS, Flexential. To your point, there's at least probably a few handfuls of companies in this space where almost certainly energy efficiency is probably not something that the CEO is working on every day of the year. DataBank, CyrusOne, a lot of operators where energy efficiency is important, but probably not something where it's a core kind of OKR, like making the top 3 list for the CEO on a regular basis. Figuring out the nature of your engagement and their engagement, again, it depends on how strategic it is for them. It depends on how big the engagement is. It depends on how big or small the company, how granular these titles are going to be, and how you segment out your buyer personas, but that you're almost as a rear view mirror kind of exercise. What do I mean by rear view mirror? Well, the accounts will almost always be super obvious, like your top 10 or 20 accounts that you've sold these energy efficiency consulting services to on a regular basis. Then within those accounts, the rear view mirror is going through your CRM and talking to your account managers and your account executives and figuring out on your biggest accounts who typically is the lead person, who's typically the second most important person, both pre and post. Those are the people that you want to be largely marketing and selling to and getting in as early as possible and as often as possible to occupy significant surface area, significant real estate throughout their full journey when it comes to anything and everything having to do with energy efficiency. So it could be an ESG person, it could be a facilities person, it could be a finance person, it could be all three of those. And what's super important is that we get as client-centric as possible to understand the exact words that they use to articulate how they're going to address this kind of problem. The better job you can do of understanding their exact words, the easier it is to come up with a go-to-market strategy, a lead gen strategy, a marketing and sales strategy that really resonates. This should permeate your website copywriting, your sales enablement, your email marketing, your product marketing, certainly your digital ad strategy, for sure your events marketing strategy, both for in-person events and digital events. And largely, if ultimately you want to get to the point where most people are choosing you because of deep expertise around getting more of their kilowatts back presumably through identifying highly inefficient processes going on in their facilities and easier operations, again, maybe your data center operations, your data center ops person is a key part of all of this. But at the end of the day, once you know who the 2 or 3 people are, though each of those basically gets their own webpage, each gets their own lead generation offer. And I would argue that at least the primary and secondary get their own events series. And in your events series, essentially what you're looking to do is educate and build trust about all of the issues that are a leading indicator that are adjacent to them coming to the conclusion at some point in the coming weeks and coming months that they want to get more of their kilowatts back, that they're operating ridiculously inefficiency, they're being environmentally reprehensibly irresponsible with sustainability, they're wasting tons of money and resources. And at the end of the day, you're trying to stack the decks in your favor of shaping the criteria that they use to evaluate all of the different consulting options that could presumably be in front of them when it comes to energy efficiency consultants. I'm heavily favor of using an educational event strategy for doing this, in-person events or digital events. You could call it Energy Efficiency University, Energy Efficiency Academy, some more creative name than that. I hope that as hundreds of people watch this recording that you don't choose the exact same name. You need something to differentiate your company. But the basic idea is to turn the corner from being seen as a vendor of energy efficiency consultants to instead be seen as the be-all end-all experts when it comes to anything and everything having to do with energy efficiency and restoring kilowatts, bringing the kilowatts back under control. So there's all of a sudden more capacity to bring more servers, more clients into the space and making for much easier operations. So it pays itself back. And again, it's up to you to decide how you're going to articulate this depending on the nature of what's coming up and their goals and challenges. But the better job you can do with being seen more as a teacher and a consultant and a subject matter expert and trusted advisor, the better you're going to do with improving your positioning. With larger companies, this can be a somewhat crowded segment with a lot of competition. I think with smaller companies, the challenge is, can you cost effectively work with companies that are relatively small, that are just barely able to afford your engagement? And again, these are business model and targeting decisions and roadmap decisions. But at the end of the day, for marketing and selling, how your company's capabilities to restore kilowatts, dozens of kilowatts, potentially hundreds or thousands of kilowatts of capacity to facilities that are using these inefficiently, to make them available for the sales team to go back in and use the space more efficiently. On a global level, there's so many great companies and individuals that are tackling like decarbonization, like what comes after PUE, how do we better measure that? I've had a lot of these folks on the Data Center Go-to-Market podcast in recent months. Definitely go check out some of the great interviews that are in there around sustainability. But at the end of the day, for your particular firm that wants to be top of mind with a very specific segment of the marketplace for energy efficiency and getting these kilowatts back and through their operations, be very, very specific about who they are, what they care about, and how you can potentially help them. But just recognize that we need to, by definition, intercept them anywhere from a couple of weeks to a couple of months. So we need to understand that full journey. What's the leading indicator to where there's going to be a very natural conclusion when they get to like the mid part of the journey, when they get to like step 5, 6, or 10 or something like that, out of step 28, where they'll be like, oh, yeah, we're wasting a ton of kilowatts. And when they do that, you want them to be hanging around with you early and often, getting to really, really fall in love with the value prop and the expertise and the know, like, and trust with your company's internal subject matter experts. And it's a balancing act. You can't give away the whole punchline of what your consulting methodology is, but you do need to sample from it, because in most cases, it's super, super important that you're reaching the right people at the right time, in the right places, and most of all for the right reasons, so they see you as the be-all end-all experts when it comes to anything and everything having to do with data center energy efficiency. So that's at a high level the core playbook that I'd lean on for an energy efficiency consultancy that wants to better market and better sell, specifically around the value proposition of helping their clients get their kilowatts back so they can do other things with those kilowatts, bring more clients or use the capacity, and have much easier operations. And that brings us to our final question in this week's Data Center Go-to-Market Sales and Marketing Q&A show. If you've been enjoying this week's show, be sure to hit the like button. And if you have an idea for a topic, a question, or a challenge that you think we should address in an upcoming episode, be sure to leave that in the comments wherever you like to watch. Oh, also, if you want to make sure you get notified about upcoming shows like this, make sure to subscribe to the Data Center Sales and Marketing newsletter directly on our website, so you can get notified about events like this directly to your email inbox on Sundays. You can sign up for free directly on our site at www.dcsmi.com. So what is our final question for this week? Drum roll, please. So now we're back in data center operators and technology services. And what we tend to find over time is a lot of the questions that come up in the show are straddling more than one part of the data center ecosystem, because there's some really natural kinds of business models that straddle more than one part of the ecosystem. There's a lot of client needs about that. The smaller the company is, the more incredibly important it is for them to have a single point of accountability. That's a lot of the reason why companies look to outsourced managed services kinds of companies for these in the first place. So this particular question is from a co-location and data center services company that wants to know how to close sales faster. So how does a data center services and co-location company close sales faster? How to close co-location and data center services sales faster? That is a fantastic question. And where I see companies struggling with most is getting really tight on who their ideal clients are with this. Co-location is becoming really crowded. It's now a very mature industry. It's facing a lot of the commoditization pressures that I saw happening with web hosting companies about 10 years ago. So just the idea that you recognize that your company is simultaneously involved in both co-location and data center services is actually a pretty good thing. I worry about the co-location operators that are still so real estate focused that they're primarily just like selling space and power and connectivity. It's almost like they feel that they're running a co-working facility for servers. It's like, they took someone that was selling co-working memberships, like WeWork kind of memberships, a couple of weeks ago, and they bring them into their co-location facility. And they're like, yeah, go rent spaces on the rack or in the cabinets for companies that need to place their servers here. That's one extreme. Most of the companies that are thriving and surviving in this highly commoditized space, especially if they're selling to SMBs, small, medium-sized businesses, where local community involvement is super important, are getting heavily involved in providing IT services, data center services to their core clients. So in addition to selling the space and the power and the hookup to the connectivity to get them to the Meet Me room, they're also selling all kinds of services that go along with it. And some of the managed services may be bundled into the monthly membership. In some cases, they're add-ons. In some cases, the companies don't provide them at all themselves, but have relationships with managed service providers that are essentially channel partners. And in return for the channel partners essentially bringing business into the co-location facility, the managed service providers get first crack at the usually margin-rich, highly profitable managed services that can be provided above and beyond just the servers, the equipment living in that particular facility. In some cases, you call it like remote hands. There's a lot of different business models that center around this. There's a lot of different ways to decide how deep or how superficially you get involved in providing these kinds of IT services to your clients, which recognize from my standpoint, the co-location operators that are much better positioned to survive and thrive in the future are the ones that have gone way beyond just seeing themselves as being in the real estate business and also see themselves as being in the IT services business. So much so that, especially if you're selling to small, medium-sized businesses, the whole idea of anything and everything having to do with IT infrastructure is completely on the table. What do I mean by that? Well, going back decades, and back when I was providing like fractional CTO services to small, medium-sized businesses, a lot of the value proposition of why a small company, even in some cases a mid-sized company, decides to outsource to a fractional CTO, a fractional CIO, a managed service provider, is they're promising that single point of contact. They don't want 8 different vendors blaming each other for why something doesn't work. That's why you've seen over time that one of the other really popular kinds of channel partners besides IT consultancies and managed service providers is the idea of an integrator who is responsible for integrating lots of different products and services from lots of different companies. And there's a huge role for that in the context of co-location data centers. So anything and everything. And usually the only point of demarcation that I've seen over time is that the IT staff that works in the co-location facilities won't go out in the field to visit clients' offices and home offices and other field locations because the owners typically don't want their system engineers going out in the field to do work. They'll instead lean on their managed service provider partners to fill that gap. So there's still a single point of accountability. It's just a matter of like your full-time payrolled equivalents that are in your data center facility. They're working on projects that can be done in the facility or done remotely without having to physically drive somewhere. It's utilization rate, business model, unit economics kinds of things. So for this kind of business that wants to be able to close sales faster, getting really dialed into who the ideal clients are is incredibly important. And if you are in a major metropolitan area with high levels of population density, I would encourage you to think about the vertical markets, the industries where you've been most successful in, and double and triple down on those. So what does that mean? Let's say, for example, you're looking in your CRM, you're looking in your finance, your accounting software, you're talking about this with your CFO and your CEO and your CFO, and you've determined that, yeah, we do really well with companies that are in manufacturing and financial services. We have a really hard time profitably servicing government clients and education clients. So manufacturing, financial services, what can we do to build a deep business around that? Well, it's basically a go-to-market playbook for each of those. And for a co-location operator that has the resources, what I would encourage you to do is actually have a separate sales team or at least a separate account executive for each of those 2 segments. And I would ideally look to go out in the market and get someone that has some career experience working in manufacturing and working in financial services. If not through, it's not even that critical that they worked for a data center operator in the past. You and probably 3 to 6 months can get them up to speed on most of what they need to know to do that effectively. But having that very deep connection to that particular industry, because maybe they worked in SaaS or they worked in telecommunications, or maybe they worked for a managed service provider who actually is a partner of your company in the past. There's a lot of adjacencies here, but there's a lot to be said for a co-location data center services company avoiding commoditization by specializing in 2, 3, 4 different industries, vertical markets, and by specializing at the absolute minimum, having a pre-sales and a post-sales person with deep expertise in that particular segment. Then the goal for a lot of closing sales faster and lead generation is to think about, okay, in manufacturing and in financial services, when we define that as a big part of your ideal client profile and we build the target account list and we go and look at who the core buyer personas are, who the first and second most important buyer personas are in a manufacturing company, and the first and second most important buyer personas in a financial services company that aligns perfectly with your ideal client. For a co-location data center, it's usually a client that's within a 30 or 60-minute drive. It's usually big enough to afford your minimums, but not so large that they want one of the big guys. I don't know, maybe you have been successful selling to Fortune 500 companies or Fortune 1000 companies, but usually most smaller co-location operators that are thinking about how to be in both of these lines of business, they usually tend to focus more on the small to mid-size. I would tell you as you're hiring over time, I would try to make sure that you're focusing primarily on larger small businesses and more of the mid-market, bigger budgets, more stability, not quite as nearly as much competition as the upper end of mid-market and going into the enterprises. But a lot of competing and winning there is specializing by vertical. It's a can't miss theme that we're seeing throughout the data center ecosystem is we're seeing sales leaders that are deciding that, gee, if we get someone who has a similar background to the prospects and clients that they're working with, they'll have a lot more street cred. They understand the language, they understand the issues, they have a built-in network of contacts. They will ramp so much faster than someone that's completely cold to that particular industry or trying to sell simultaneously to a handful of different industries and not getting deeply specialized enough. So in terms of closing sales faster, I think that industry specialization really dialing in that part of the ICP is really important. That certainly factors into the hiring plans, like I was just alluding to a moment ago. And then the second part of that is especially for a locally focused colo operator that's also in data center services that has 1 or 2 or 3 facilities. I would focus on getting as many people from those target accounts to visit your facility on a regular basis as often as you possibly can. That adds value. So here's how I would approach this. Let's say, for example, you have a account executive who's dedicated to your primary and secondary buyer personas at manufacturers, and you have another account executive or an account team that's dedicated to your primary and secondary buyer persona in financial services companies. So you build your target account list, you do your buyer persona research, and you figure out the 5 or 10 biggest goals and challenges that each of those buyer personas are dealing with. So you end up with 10 or 20 topics that are really hot, that are really top of mind among manufacturing companies in the area, among financial services companies in the area, specifically with these job roles. And you take those 10 or 20 topics and once a month over the next 12, 18, 24 months, host an educational event in your facility that teaches that persona how they can do their job better based on goals that they've articulated that likely show up very high in job descriptions and show up in objectives and key results of things that they need to figure out to meet their performance reviews, to potentially get promoted, to potentially get a bonus, whatever it is, to exceed their company's growth goals on an individual basis, on a team basis, on a company basis, and what they're struggling with most. And when you take that client-centric approach and you segment out this event schedule, so let's say the first Wednesday of the month, you host a breakfast event from 8:30 to 10 o'clock in the morning. And the third Wednesday of the month, your financial services person, your financial services team does the exact same thing to the IT executives or whoever, the channel partners, whoever it is that's actively involved in the financial services side of having infrastructure issues that are a leading indicator of needing co-location and outsourced data center services. So every single month you're hosting this event in your classroom, in your conference room. Maybe you only can seat 15, 20 people. The great part, though, is those 15 or 20 people that you're inviting are coming from your target accounts. It's the exact people that you want to be building up know, like, and trust with on an ongoing basis. And when this works well, you start to see multiple people attending from the same company. So you're proactively driving alignment when you're in a position to be able to really make a dent in indoctrinating those folks about your best practices of how someone just like that in that particular job function and that particular kind of company can really move the needle with goal attainment. And conversely, how they can address some of the biggest things that are driving them nuts, that are stressing them out, that are messing with their work-life balance, interrupting vacations, a whole host of things that you potentially have discovered when you've done that customer insight research and that your internal or external subject matter experts can help provide some solutions to and some insight and some context about in these educational events. Again, not ridiculously complicated. Simple format could be we talked about 8:30 to 10 o'clock breakfast seminars. They arrive, there's some breakfast, they get to chat with their peers a little bit, chat with some people from your team from like 9 to 9:30, 9:40 or so is the formal part of the program. great slides, make it as interactive as possible. It is a small group. Be so confident that the slides and the content are so incredibly valuable that if they flew to the other side of the country to attend, that you'd be highly confident that if you were one of the 10 or 20 breakout sessions that they went to at the conference, that you're going to get a perfect score on the report card, on the evaluation of they absolutely love this session, and you just provided outrageously high levels of value. And then following that, of course, give them a chance to get some questions answered from your subject matter experts. And for anyone that's interested, take them on a tour around your facility. Repeat that month after month consistently. You start to see people from similar companies. Month one, there may have been 3 people from one of the companies. Month 2, you're like, wow, it's 5 or 6 people out of 20 people in the room from the same company. They're really into us. That's awesome. And then one of them comes over and says, yeah, this is great. It's great that we have so many people here. You should come in next Friday. We have an all hands. We're going to be talking about our IT roadmap for the next year. You're like, oh my gosh, that would be amazing. Can I bring pizza? So yeah, this is exactly what you're trying to do to generate leads and nurture. And when you repeat this on an ongoing basis, you're not only on the short list, you stay on the short list, and you're providing so much professional development, learning and development value, getting out of that vendor box, that you start to gradually knock competitive options out of the consideration set. So when they're finally ready for a decision-related conversation, for a decision stage conversation, for a sales-related conversation about data center services and co-location, you may sometimes find that there is no short list anymore. Your company is the short list. It's a short list of 1. You have made the cut because they've gotten so much confidence as they've gotten to learn more about your facility, your unique approaches, the people that are on your team. They're blown away, and they see you as the perfect fit for anything and everything that they need with their co-location and data center services. So that's how I would approach how to close co-location and data center sales faster, early and often. Get in as early as possible, get in as often as possible, and meet as many of the key people on that decision committee as possible by having amazingly relevant, amazingly helpful educational content. So you play a major, major role in that team's learning and development and professional development going forward. So that's how to close co-location and data center services sales faster. And that was our final question for this week's Data Center Go-to-Market Sales and Marketing Q&A show. If you've enjoyed this week's show, make sure that you hit the like button. If you have an idea for a topic or a question or a challenge that you would like to see us address in an upcoming show, be sure to leave that in the comments wherever you're watching. If you want to make sure that you get notified about upcoming educational events and resources like this, be sure to subscribe to our Data Center Sales and Marketing newsletter that comes to your email inbox on Sundays. You can subscribe for free directly on our website at www.dcsmi.com. I'm Joshua Feinberg, founder of the Data Center Sales and Marketing Institute and host of the Data Center Go-to-Market podcast. If you and I are not currently connected on LinkedIn and you'd like to be sure to mention in the invitation note that you'd like to watch the Data Center Go-to-Market Sales and Marketing Q&A show, and I'd be happy to be connected with you on LinkedIn. Really important to put that in the note. Just like you, I get dozens of requests every day. Very increasingly, I'd like to say that they're all as relevant as possible, but you can stand out from the pack and get to the front of the line there by making sure to mention that specific part of that, the Data Center Go-to-Market Sales and Marketing Q&A show, in your notes. So glad that you're able to join us for this week's Data Center Go-to-Market Sales and Marketing Q&A show. We wish you great success in growing your impact, your team's impact, and your company's impact in and around data centers, digital infrastructure, and critical facilities. And we'll look forward to seeing you back again next week. Take care now.
Data Center Go-to-Market Sales and Marketing Q&A is sponsored by DCSMI, elevating the role of sales, marketing, and go-to-market GTM professionals in the growth of the data center industry. To stay informed about upcoming episodes, subscribe to the Data Center Sales and Marketing newsletter on the DCSMI website at www.dcsmi.com. Again, that's www.dcsmi.com.